When the state collapses, the black market takes its place, and he was its air force. Viktor Bout's story began far from the neon capitals of crime and power in the crumbling edges of an empire. He was born in 1967 in Dushanbe, Tajikistan, then a forgotten Soviet republic, now remembered only as the place that produced a man who would one day be called the Merchant of Death. Childhood, for him, wasn't measured in toys or games, but in scarcity, discipline, and the gray monotony of Soviet life. Concrete buildings, empty stores, military parades on cracked streets. It was a world where obedience was survival, and silence was a skill. He grew up at the intersection of cultures, Persian, Russian, Central Asian, absorbing languages like a sponge. By the time he was a teenager, he could speak several tongues, a talent that would later become his passport to every battlefield on Earth. His peers saw just another quiet boy in a broken city. But Bout was already studying people, watching systems, learning how power shifted when order disappeared. For him, knowledge wasn't an academic pursuit. It was a weapon in waiting. As a young man, he entered the Soviet military and trained as a linguist. Officially, he was serving the state. In reality, he was serving his education in chaos. He learned not just words, but codes, structures, the hidden grammar of control. He saw how armies moved, how supply chains fed soldiers, how wars depended not on ideology but on logistics. In the rigid order of the Soviet system, Bout discovered the blueprint of disorder. Then came 1991. The empire collapsed, Moscow's red flag fell, and with it, an entire world unraveled. Across 15 new republics, chaos spread like wildfire. Warehouses full of rifles stood unguarded. Airfields rotted with abandoned cargo planes. Generals and ministers turned into merchants overnight, selling everything not nailed down. It was the end of an empire, but for Viktor Bout, it was the beginning of a marketplace. Where others saw ruins, he saw resources. He understood something no one else wanted to admit. Collapse wasn't an ending, it was an opportunity. Borders once sealed by tanks were now wide open. Guns without owners became commodities. Pilots without jobs became partners. Bout recognized that warlords, rebels, dictators, and governments all had one thing in common. They needed supplies. And he would be the man to deliver them. In this new lawless world, he didn't choose to hide. He chose to disappear in plain sight, to become a shadow that moved between continents, invisible yet indispensable. He wasn't chasing fame or ideology. He was chasing leverage, the ability to walk into any conflict, any zone of chaos, and walk out richer, stronger, untouchable. And so the boy from Dushanbe stepped into history. Not with a gun, not with an army, but with something far more dangerous. The vision to turn collapse into capital, and the will to live as a ghost in the wreckage of a fallen empire. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the ground beneath Viktor Bout shifted, but the skies opened wide. Across Eastern Europe and Central Asia, abandoned cargo planes sat on cracked runways like stranded giants. Most people saw useless relics of a fallen empire. Bout saw flying vaults. He bought them cheap, one by one, using shell companies and middlemen, piecing together a private air force. Antonovs, Ilyushins, aging workhorses of the Soviet arsenal, machines that could carry tons of cargo across deserts, jungles, and war zones. To the world, they looked like rusting relics. To Bout, they were wings of fortune. With these planes, he turned chaos into business. He could land in the Sahara at night, in the Colombian jungle at dawn, in a Middle Eastern desert by noon. Borders meant nothing, customs meant nothing. Bout had pilots who could fly blind, mechanics who could patch engines with scrap, and contacts who cleared runways with bribes. He turned abandoned Soviet stock into a global delivery system, one invisible to governments, yet vital to every warlord who needed supplies. And he delivered everything. Weapons, of course, rifles, rocket launchers, ammunition by the ton, but also pot, powder, crystal, dope. Stuff that fueled not only wars but addictions, economies of the underworld. If it fit into a cargo hold, it could be moved. Bout was not in the business of asking questions. He was in the business of saying yes. Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, it didn't matter. He wasn't loyal to ideology, tribe, or state. His loyalty was to the transaction. Civil wars became his playground. Rebels in Angola, warlords in Liberia, militias in Sierra Leone. They all needed weapons. Bout's planes landed on dirt strips, unloaded crates of rifles, then took off with diamonds, gold, timber. In the Middle East, sanctioned regimes used him to bypass embargoes. In Latin America, cartels looked to him for the same reason governments did: reliability. When the world shut a door, Bout opened a runway. His genius was not just in moving cargo, but in staying untouchable. He built a labyrinth of companies, each registered in different countries, each designed to hide the next. Planes were constantly reflagged, renamed, repainted. Crews rotated. Flight logs disappeared. To the outside world, his fleet was a ghost armada, a system without a center. Even intelligence agencies struggled to keep track. The moment they identified one of his planes, it was already gone, reborn under a new identity. For Bout, the skies were not just a business, they were a sanctuary. He knew that while wars were fought on the ground, their lifeblood came from above. Whoever controlled supply controlled survival, and Viktor Bout controlled the skies. He was not a soldier, but he armed armies. He was not a politician, but he shifted governments. He was not a general, but he decided which side lived and which side died. His power was not in bullets fired, but in bullets delivered. By the late 1990s, his name was whispered across continents. To rebels, he was salvation. To governments, he was a curse. To the United Nations, he was a problem they couldn't solve. And to the United States, he was a phantom. Everywhere and nowhere. A man who turned old Soviet steel into wings of chaos. And yet, through it all, he remained invisible. No speeches, no banners, no flags. Just cargo planes rising into the night sky, carrying death, carrying power, carrying the proof that in the new world of collapsed borders, Viktor Bout had found his throne, not on the ground, but in the air. By the mid-1990s, Viktor Bout was no longer just a man with planes. He was an empire without a flag. His network stretched from the frozen airstrips of Eastern Europe to the dirt runways of West Africa, from Middle Eastern deserts to South American jungles. Wherever chaos lived, his shadow followed. And in that shadow, he built a system so vast, so intricate, that even intelligence agencies struggled to map its edges. At the heart of his empire were shell companies. Dozens at first, then hundreds, scattered across the globe. Each existed on paper more than in reality, registered in tax havens, signed under false names, dissolved and reborn overnight. They bought planes, leased hangars, signed contracts. One company could be traced to Belgium, another to South Africa, a third to the UAE. On paper, none of them were linked. In truth, every one of them answered to Viktor Bout. Passports were another tool of invisibility. Bout's pilots carried multiple identities, moving across borders like ghosts. If a name appeared on a watch list, a new one was issued. If a country banned his aircraft, the tail number changed. One Antonov might fly under a Moldovan flag in the morning, then land under a Liberian registry by nightfall. Flags of convenience turned his planes into phantoms, and phantoms could not be stopped. The airstrips were his lifelines. In jungles, deserts, and mountains, crude runways appeared where none had been before. Dirt roads flattened by bulldozers, secret strips cut into forest clearings, hidden ports where no customs officer dared to go. To warlords, these runways were miracles. To governments, they were nightmares. For Bout, they were simply doors. Doors that opened where borders closed. Every flight log was a fiction. Destinations falsified, manifests rewritten, cargo declared as humanitarian aid or machinery. A plane carrying rifles could be listed as transporting farm equipment. A hold packed with rocket launchers could be described as spare parts. Paper covered reality, and reality vanished into the night sky. For officials, investigating his routes was like chasing smoke. By the time they pieced together one puzzle, the game had already moved elsewhere. And so planes vanished into thin air, carrying tons of stuff meant to fuel wars. One shipment could tip the balance of a battlefield. 1,000 rifles might extend a civil war for years. A few crates of powder or crystal could fund an army. Bout didn't care which side benefited. His only concern was that the payment arrived. Cash, diamonds, gold, sometimes even oil. Currency mattered less than consistency. As long as the world kept burning, his empire would keep flying. Governments stumbled because of him. Sanctions meant nothing when Bout's planes could bypass them in the dead of night. Warlords thrived because of him, turning ragtag militias into forces armed well enough to topple regimes. Conflicts that should have died out dragged on, their fires kept alive by a steady stream of weapons and supplies. Wherever international law tried to impose order, Viktor Bout proved that order was an illusion. And through it all, he stayed invisible. He didn't boast, didn't grant interviews, didn't parade his wealth. His face was unknown to most of the men who depended on him. They knew only the system, the plane that arrived when promised, the crates that matched the order, the certainty that in a world of broken promises, Viktor Bout delivered. By the end of the decade, his empire had no borders, no capital, no fixed address. It existed in the air, in paperwork, in shadows. Governments called him a criminal, rebels called him a savior, intelligence agencies called him a ghost. But to the man himself, he was none of these. He was simply a businessman, running a service the world refused to admit it needed. Because Viktor Bout understood something no one else dared to. Borders could be crossed, laws could be bent, and wars could always be supplied. And as long as chaos demanded fuel, his empire would never end. By the turn of the millennium, Viktor Bout's shadow stretched further than anyone could map. His name, once whispered only in the corridors of conflict zones, now echoed in the halls of global intelligence. From Washington to Brussels, from Moscow to Nairobi, agents tracked the ghost of a man who seemed everywhere and nowhere at once. Bout had become more than a pilot, more than a trafficker of weapons and stuff. He had become a symbol of a new kind of power. A power that did not require armies or territory, only logistics, cunning, and invisibility. The United Nations officially called him the world's biggest arms dealer. Reports documented his flights, his companies, the destinations of his cargo, but evidence rarely survived outside paper. His planes crossed borders that were supposedly closed, carried weapons into regions supposedly embargoed, and vanished before anyone could intervene. Bout's empire was a reminder that in the new century, control was no longer about tanks or fortresses. It was about networks, mobility, and the ability to exist outside the reach of law. The United States labeled him Merchant of Death. The phrase was calculated, dramatic, meant to convey the danger of a man who sold instruments of war to every side, yet remained untouchable. But in private, Bout denied it all. To him, there were no heroes or villains, only customers and services. Morality was a concept for others to debate. Supply and demand was reality. Every crate delivered, every flight completed, every contract honored was simply business. Death was an unintended consequence, an externality he neither glorified nor ignored. Bout's operations were global, but his footprint was impossible to pin down. He never stayed in one country for long. He rented apartments under false names, traveled under multiple passports, and rarely met clients face to face. Instead, his planes did the talking. A shipment delivered was proof enough of his power. A flight that disappeared without trace was proof of his untouchability. Governments could sanction, embargo, and investigate, but Bout had already moved 3 steps ahead, invisible in the shadow of his own creation. Intelligence agencies tried to map him, to anticipate his next move, but Bout was not predictable. He thrived on ambiguity. One day, a shipment might appear in West Africa, the next in South America, the next in the Middle East. Routes changed daily. Flight logs were falsified. Even those who worked with him knew only fragments of the network. Trust was built not on personal loyalty, but on reliability. Bout delivered, and nothing more was asked. Despite his denial, Bout's reputation grew. Warlords called him a savior. Governments called him a scourge. International media labeled him a criminal genius, a man who turned the collapse of the Soviet Union into a global business empire. But the truth, as Bout understood it, was simpler. He was a businessman exploiting a world that still refused to confront its own weaknesses. Wars required arms. Conflicts needed supply. And there was one man who could deliver. No questions asked. By the early 2000s, the world was watching, though few could touch him. Bout's empire was a mirror reflecting the failures of governments and the fragility of law. Borders meant little, morality less, and consequence almost nothing. In every conflict, in every shadow market, his presence was felt. Invisible, untouchable, unstoppable. He was the ghost in the air, the unseen hand behind every shipment, a man whose business had no conscience but whose impact shaped continents. And yet, through it all, he remained calm, detached, almost invisible in his own myth. To him, this was not infamy. It was efficiency. This was not notoriety. It was survival. The world noticed. Bout did not flinch, he simply flew on. By 2008, Viktor Bout's empire had grown into a force that governments feared, but could rarely touch. He had flown cargo planes full of rifles, rocket launchers, and artillery across continents, moving weapons, pot, powder, crystal, and dope into war zones where no official authority dared tread. His name was legendary in intelligence circles, whispered in private meetings and classified reports. To the United States, he was more than a man. He was a phantom, a symbol of the world's unchecked black markets, a merchant of death whose reach extended far beyond any conventional battlefield. And yet, for all his cunning and invisibility, Bout had a vulnerability, ambition, and perhaps a faint sense of trust in the people he dealt with. The DEA, after years of gathering intelligence, devised a plan that would lure him into their grasp. Agents posed as Colombian rebels desperate for weapons, the kind capable of downing helicopters, the kind that could destabilize entire regions. Bout, ever the businessman, evaluated the opportunity with clinical precision. The order was massive, lucrative, and urgent. Every instinct he had honed over decades in the skies told him it was profitable. Every rule he had lived by whispered caution, but the potential gain outweighed the risk. Bout agreed. In the heat of Bangkok, the trap was laid. A luxury hotel room became the stage for the downfall of a man who had outrun governments for decades. Plans, flight schedules, and shipment manifests were irrelevant here. There were no planes to hide behind, no fake papers, no shell companies to obscure his identity. The walls that once echoed with the hum of jet engines and the shuffle of secret crews now echoed with the footsteps of law enforcement. Bout, the ghost who had danced above borders for years, was suddenly concrete bound. Handcuffs replaced his freedom. Negotiation replaced flight. The extradition process was swift by legal standards, though complicated by international law and diplomatic wrangling. Bout was transported from Thailand to the United States, leaving behind the skies that had been both his shield and his weapon. In America, he faced charges that reflected the scope of his empire: conspiracy to kill Americans, conspiracy to provide weapons to terrorists, and conspiracy to supply conflicts he did not choose but profited from. Each accusation was a catalog of his past operations, a litany of wars enabled by his planes, his logistics, and his network. Bout's arrest marked a turning point not just in his life but in the global perception of arms trafficking. Intelligence agencies that had once chased shadows realized that even the most untouchable figures could be ensnared with patience, precision, and the right bait. Yet, for Bout, the capture was more than a personal failure. It was the first real test of the empire he had built. Could the network survive without him orchestrating every flight? Could shell companies, fake passports, and hidden airstrips continue to operate in the absence of the ghost who had once guided them from above? Even in handcuffs, Bout remained unbroken. Observers described him as calm, measured, almost bored. He had seen governments rise and fall, armies crumble, borders redraw, and yet he retained a sense of control, a quiet authority born from decades in the sky. For all the charges, all the extradition proceedings, the man who had moved mountains of weapons and contraband remained a figure of awe. His empire, though threatened, had been forged too thoroughly to collapse entirely overnight. The Bangkok arrest was a masterstroke by the DEA, but it also underscored the complexity of Bout's world. He was not just a smuggler or a criminal. He was a logistical genius, a businessman operating in the shadows of legality, morality, and power. The trap had caught the man, but the legacy of his flights, his planes, and the wars they fueled would continue to ripple across continents long after he had been led away in cuffs. Bout, the invisible airman, the ghost of the Soviet skies, had finally been brought down, but the world he had created in the clouds would endure. And for those who studied him, who traced his flights, and cataloged his shipments, the lesson was clear. The ghost might be caged, but the empire was not yet grounded. In 2011, Viktor Bout was convicted in a U.S. federal court, sentenced to 25 years for conspiracy to provide weapons to terrorists, conspiracy to kill Americans, and countless other charges stemming from decades of global operations. The court documents painted him as a mastermind, a man who had built a shadow empire that spanned continents, conflicts, and markets. Yet for Bout, the sentence was another obstacle, another challenge to navigate, albeit this time one he could not fly over. Once a ghost in the skies, he became a ghost in a cell. Gone were the Antonovs and Ilyushins, the secret airstrips, and the network of planes and crews that had once been extensions of his will. Gone were the shell companies, the fake passports, the falsified manifests. In their place were concrete walls, locked doors, and the unrelenting silence of a maximum security prison. No hum of engines, no radio chatter, no shipments to organize. Only time stretching long and still, measured in hours, minutes, and footsteps echoing through the halls. But even in confinement, Bout's legend did not fade. Across the world, intelligence analysts, journalists, and historians traced the routes of his flights, reconstructed the hidden airstrips, and mapped the shadowy businesses that had once enabled wars and profited from chaos. His life became the blueprint of a modern criminal enterprise, meticulous, invisible, and terrifyingly efficient. Hollywood took notice. Films depicted men inspired by him, villains molded in his image, novels chronicled the empire he had built, academics debated the implications of his networks. Everywhere, the name Viktor Bout became synonymous with the ability to exploit global chaos with precision. Prison, however, could not erase the man entirely. Though confined to a cell, his influence still resonated. His former clients, his pilots, and his partners adapted, maintaining operations without him, a testament to the empire he had built with such discipline and foresight. The planes still flew. The market still depended on him, even in absentia. His empire had become a system, capable of functioning without the man at its helm. For Bout, survival meant adaptation. He remained calm, deliberate, and seemingly unaffected by the world outside, as if his years in flight had trained him for confinement. Prisoners, guards, and officials alike remarked on his demeanor. Quiet, measured, observant. There was no panic, no despair, only the subtle presence of a man who had mastered movement, logistics, and opportunity so completely that even walls could not diminish him. He became the ultimate ghost, physically contained, but conceptually untouchable. In 2022, over a decade after his sentencing, the United States traded Bout back to Russia in a prisoner swap. To some, it was a concession, a diplomatic necessity. To others, it was proof that even ghosts carried value. Bout returned to his homeland, a free man in the eyes of his government, yet forever marked by the consequences of his actions abroad. His return was quiet, almost ghost-like, as if he had never left the shadows at all. And through it all, the story of Viktor Bout remained one of paradox. A man who had orchestrated global conflicts, trafficked weapons, pot, powder, crystal, and dope across continents, yet had become invisible in plain sight. A man whose empire outlived his freedom. A man whose legend persisted because the systems he built were larger than any single cell, any single plane, any single arrest. He didn't just sell weapons, he sold chaos. And for a time, chaos made him king.